Hi, I'm Reece Coleman, Waterways and Wetlands Research Manager at Melbourne Water in the Research and Modelling team. Welcome to another edition of our Waterways Research Lunchtime Seminars. Before I go any further, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands in which we're all meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their deep and long connection to waterways in the region for tens of thousands of years. I'm joining today from Waterway country. Today's research seminar will be presented by Dr. Belinda Hatt, who's in the Waterways and Wetlands Research team at Melbourne Water, but also seconded full-time to the Melbourne Waterway Research to Practice partnership with the University of Melbourne. Belinda will be talking about one of her research projects, which is understanding the management of water-sensitive urban design on private land using contrasting case studies across Greater Melbourne. And this research is really important because we know it's an important part of achieving our healthy waterway strategy stormwater targets, that we need to do things at the lot scale, streetscape, end of pipe and precinct. We're going to have to combine these efforts to achieve the targets. So Belinda's research is really helping us to understand the role and opportunities in the private land space. Belinda will be talking for about half an hour. So I hope you enjoy Belinda's presentation, and over to you, Belinda. Thank you.
So thanks for that preamble, Reece. I think I can just get straight into it. Other than I'd just like to start by acknowledging my colleagues that I've been working with for several years on this project, so Dr. Darren Boss and Dr. Stephanie LeBeau. So to step back a bit, we know that stormwater is the biggest cause of degraded waterways in urban areas, and we also know that to protect waterways from stormwater, we really need to keep as much stormwater out of the waterways as possible. And so for the last few decades, there have been concerted efforts to intervene and manage stormwater particularly in the public domain. But privately owned land makes up a large proportion of urban areas, and so to give you a few figures for context, in Mount Evelyn, a suburb near Lilydale, about half of the impervious surfaces that are directly connected to waterways are on private land, and in more inner Melbourne, about a third of the runoff volume that's generated each area in the Marybeck local government area comes from private roofs. Urban areas are also really highly space-constrained spaces, and there's lots of competing demands for public land. And we also know that it's more feasible to achieve stormwater flow targets if stormwater is managed at or as close to source as possible. And that's because the hydrologic impacts are compounded as scale increases. And so for all of these reasons, we're increasingly starting to see municipalities requiring on-site stormwater management on private land through their planning schemes. But there's lots of barriers to successful water-sensitive urban design assets, and I'll start by talking about the general barriers. So that includes things like our planning and institutional practices, our capacity to design and construct quality assets. This figure down the bottom illustrates the stages in the lifespan of water-sensitive urban design assets, or stormwater control measures, which I'll probably use interchangeably throughout this presentation. But there is a tendency to only focus on the stages up until the construction period, and that often can result in insufficient maintenance for multiple reasons, including financial barriers, a lack of knowledge on what to do and how often it needs to be done, and a lack of clarity about roles and responsibilities around maintenance. So all of those things apply to both public and private domains. But then when we think about private land, there's some additional challenges as well. So for organisations that have an accountability for stormwater management, there's generally a lack of oversight beyond the planning process. It's also reliant on community participation, and the capacity and interest of community to get involved in urban water management is highly variable. And there's lots of changes in ownership of private land. So what we did in this research project was we reviewed 4 different case studies where stormwater control measures there'd been widespread installation of stormwater control measures on residential properties. And in reviewing these case studies, we sort of really wanted to explore the condition of those assets and try to identify whether there were, what factors influence the success or underperformance of those stormwater control measures. And I'll probably stop talking about stormwater control measures in general now and refer to them more just as rainwater tanks, because this is the focus of this project. All right, I'll tell you a little bit about each of those case studies before I then talk about what we learned from this review. So Coburg Hill was an urban renewal project. It's located on what was the former Kodak film manufacturing site in Coburg. And when that plant was shut down in the early 2000s, a portion of the site was rezoned for residential development. So it's a 21-hectare site that has about 500 dwellings and a range of densities. In response to local government requirements for stormwater management, the developer decided to install rainwater tanks on about 80% of those properties. And so each of those properties were required to install either 2 or 3 kilolitre tanks, and that tank size was tied to the roof area. There was also streetscape assets that were installed, but given that they are on public land, that's beyond the scope of this project. And actually, that's sort of the case for all of the case studies. All the streetscape or public land assets are out of scope. So probably one thing to note about this case study is that owners bought the lots, and then it was up to them to engage their own builders, and that included for installing rainwater tanks. And I'll come back to why that's important later. Partway through the construction process, local government really wanted to know how it was going, and so an audit was conducted to confirm tank installation and connection to toilet, that connection to toilet and irrigation was occurring as planned. And those areas that are shaded pink on this map are the areas that were included in the audit. The other areas hadn't been constructed at the time. I'm sure many of you will be aware of Little Stream Bark Creek. It's a 20-year catchment scale experiment, a proof of concept type experiment that really aimed to ask the question, can urban development and ecologically healthy streams coexist? Or in other words, can we keep enough stormwater out of the creek to protect it? And so this was an existing area where the project team worked with residents and other private landowners to install a range of stormwater control measures on private land. Rainwater tanks tended to be the most popular, and those rainwater tanks were connected to toilet and laundry. And because it was an existing urban area, it relied on voluntary participation, and that was encouraged through a range of financial incentives. Because it was a research project, there was lots of monitoring that was undertaken, and that included asset performance, stream response to these stormwater interventions, and community participation in the project. And the part of the research that we're particularly interested in for this project was a self-assessment survey of tank owners. Just over the other side of the Dandenong Ranges is Dobson's Creek, and this is another catchment scale experiment that started after the Little Stringy Bark Creek experiment, and it really aimed to sort of look at, well, can we take what we've learned from the Little Stringy Bark Creek project and apply it to another location? So again, a retrofit into existing residential properties. This time, rather than offer a range of stormwater control measures, residents were offered just rainwater tanks, and the number of rainwater tanks that they were offered depended on the size of their roof area. And those tanks were all connected to toilet and laundry, and they also included a dripper hose that enabled a portion of the tank to slowly draw down and passively irrigate adjacent garden areas. Again, participation was encouraged through a range of incentives through 2 rounds. In the first round, residents were offered free tanks, and then in the second round there was a co-funding model, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go on. Again, a lot of research and monitoring was undertaken, including maintenance audits, monitoring of the stream health, and community participation in the project. The final case study is Aqua Revo, and this was a residential redevelopment of what was formerly the site of the Cranbourne treatment plant. So Southeast Water owned this land, and they saw this as an opportunity to pilot a range of integrated water management and energy saving initiatives. And amongst those initiatives, each of the and as part of that pilot project, each of the residential properties received a 2 kilolitre rainwater tank, and that tank was connected to showers, baths and laundry. What was different about this project is that real-time monitoring and control of those tanks was included, and so that included active monitoring of the operational status, alerts for potential maintenance requirements, and the option to release water from the tanks ahead of forecast rainfall in order to capture incoming stormwater. The other key difference with this project was that South East Water assumed responsibility for operation and maintenance for the first 10 years. So to sum up the ways that each of these case studies differed, so there was different organisations involved. The timing for installation of the rainwater tanks differed from either as part of the initial construction process or retrofit into existing properties. Some were compulsory, some were voluntary. Maintenance responsibilities were either the owners, the property owners, or in the case of Aquarivo, outsourced to a third party, and the way that the tanks were operated, whether it was passive operation or active through real-time monitoring and control. And I suppose now's probably a good time to point out that, look, really this was an opportunistic review. We, rather than specifically collect data for this project, we made use of the information that was available. And so I suppose that was less than ideal in a way, in that the nature of the audits that were conducted at each of the case studies was varied, and the type and detail of the information that was available varied as well. Nevertheless, I think we were able to draw some useful findings from the review, and I'll talk about that now. And I'm going to present it as a series of lessons that are loosely ordered in terms of the typical life cycle of stormwater control measure. So starting with planning, local government planning schemes were found to be an effective way to enact stormwater management on private land. They were used in two different ways in these case studies. So at Coburg Hill, they were used to require tank installation as part of the initial development. And despite council having no oversight beyond the issuing of planning permits, the audit confirmed that rainwater tanks were being installed and connected at 96% of the surveyed properties. At Little Stringabark Creek, an environmental significance overlay was implemented because the project team was finding that new impervious areas were being connected as fast as they were able to disconnect existing urban areas. And so that environmental significance overlay was triggered anytime there was ongoing development greater than 10 square metres. Some things to think about though, if you are going to use local government planning schemes. There was surprisingly low resident awareness of tanks at Coburg Hill. And look, this is probably pretty consistent with other research on mandated versus voluntary rainwater tanks. But it was of concern in that if residents aren't aware of their rainwater tanks, how can they be expected to be, it probably follows that there's not a lot of maintenance going on. At Little Stringabark Creek, there were a lot of supporting instruments that were required for the environmental significance overlay, and that included practice notes to help residents develop a stormwater treatment plan, although they tended to still rely really heavily on a stormwater treatment assessor who was a consultant who was an expert in stormwater management to help them develop their treatment plans. There's also that issue about oversight or the lack of oversight beyond the planning stage, and we're increasingly seeing local governments employing water-sensitive urban design officers who are conducting spot checks of new developments to check that stormwater control measures that were required as part of the planning permit are being installed. So community engagement is essential for raising awareness and encouraging participation, particularly in retrofit situations. Having said that, though, engagement is still really important for the mandate situations. We've just talked about the low awareness of tanks at Coburg Hill and the potential implications for maintenance. But cost and time are key barriers to participation. So some things that the case studies that we found in the case studies that really helped support engagement and participation were things like knowing your audience, because this enables you to tailor your messaging in a way that resonates with local residents. And using a range of clear and integrated communications, it was found to be really helpful because it accommodates individual preferences and technological competencies. Having said that, though, face-to-face was found to be the most effective, and that included, particularly at Dobsons Creek and Little Stringabark Creek, that included things like community information sessions, and residents really liked the option of having no obligation home visits to help by a member of the project team to sort of really help talk them through what it would look like for them if they got involved in the project and had a rainwater tank installed on their property. Now, I mentioned earlier that sometimes tanks were offered free of charge, and sometimes there was a requirement for co-funding. And what we found at Dobsons Creek was that even though the tanks were heavily subsidised, in that residents were only asked to pay about 8% of the total cost of installing the rainwater tanks, this was often perceived as still being too expensive. And that co-funding model was also found to increase the complexity of the participation process, and it was actually found to be a significant barrier to participation at Dobsons Creek. Initial distrust can be a key barrier, and so things like receiving unsolicited mail, a lack of familiarity with the agencies and organisations involved with the project, and the perception that offers, the offer of a free rainwater tank is that, is something that's too good to be true and therefore must be a scam. And declining public trust in a range of institutions is an issue more broadly. But some of the things that were found to help with allaying that initial distrust were things like the use of professional and official communications, addressing risks, perceptions of risk up front, so heading off that idea that that this is fraud or a scam. And also residents sometimes had concerns that a tax might later be imposed if they were to go ahead and have a rainwater tank installed on their property. At Little Stringybark Creek, having a single point of contact, having a trusted face of the project that offered friendly and positive interactions was found to be really important to participation. And community advocacy played an important role both at Little Stringybark Creek and Dobsons Creek. So at Dobsons Creek, some residents that were initially hesitant to get involved in the project watched their friends and neighbours who were involved in round one of the project and found that they had positive experiences, and that got them over the line, encouraged them to participate in the second round of offers of rainwater tanks. And interestingly, there was also a staff member at a local cafe in the Dobsons Creek catchment that was a really big fan of the project and really advocated for the project. There's efficiency in having a consistent design in that it reduces the design choices to where you're going to put your system components and what plumbing connections that you need. So it offers savings in terms of both time and cost. It also means that the project team can offer consistent information on operation and maintenance, and it streamlines any centralised inspection and maintenance program that might be offered. I mentioned before at Coburg Hill that residents were responsible for engaging their own builders, including for installation of rainwater tanks. And what this resulted in was a wide diversity of tanks and pumps and connections that were used, and this really complicated the audit process. Nevertheless, lack of choice might be a barrier to participation. And at Dobsons Creek, some residents said they wanted more choice. And so it would be useful to think about having some flexibility to accommodate either site constraints, things like space and slope and access, and individual preferences. And so that might be like a user-paid upgrade option for things like slimline tanks or larger tanks, or even additional plumbing connections to internal demands. Moving on to maintenance, relying on residents to look after systems is risky. And look, the reality is that Aquarevo, with its real-time monitoring and control, is the gold standard. It meant that the system's almost always fully operational, and typically maintenance requirements were addressed within 24 hours of a fault being detected. At Little Stringybark Creek, at the time of the survey, 80% of respondents believed that their rainwater tank was operational, and 96% of those respondents were confident in that assessment. Nevertheless, a third of tanks had malfunctioned at some point, and the most common cause of failure was pump failure. Interestingly, though, where free inspection and maintenance services were offered, there was low uptake of that offer. So some things to think about here that might help residents look after their systems is to look, the real-time monitoring and control is the gold. It seems that is the gold standard. Having said that, though, we still don't really have a good handle on how residents feel about having public good assets on private land, and the potential for there to be misapprehensions about what about perceived monitoring of the private home. And so perhaps a way to do that, to head that off, would be to frame policies in terms of benefits to householders as opposed to exerting control on household infrastructure. At Dobsons Creek, there was considerable support for an annual fee-based service, inspection and maintenance service, and the amount that residents said they were willing to pay broadly matched the cost of providing that inspection and maintenance service. Having said that, though, it was just for the inspection and maintenance service, and there was a gap around around the cost for any repairs that might be identified. Good intentions don't always translate into owner action. So residents generally had good intentions to keep their tank systems functional. And what we're looking at here is some data from Dobsons Creek on the type and frequency of maintenance activities that were undertaken. And look, they were broadly appropriate. We can see that most residents said they were cleaning their gutters and leaf screens. To a lesser extent, there was trimming of overhanging branches and cleaning inlet screens and checking that the pump was operational. What was a little bit worrying was around the frequency of which those activities were being undertaken, and that the common response was that it was only being undertaken as required. And this is a little bit worrying in that most systems have an automatic mains backup, and this means that residents might not know that their tank is not working if water's always coming out of the tap. At Dobsons Creek as well, some residents reported concerns about dampness in their gardens and from the dripper hose. And look, and this might be because not many residents said that they were moving their dripper hose around the garden, and this is probably something that would have been something that did need to be done to make sure that there was good distribution of that water across the garden. Most residents said at Little Stringy Bark Creeks that it was important to them that their tank was operational. And interestingly, they were motivated more by environmental and water savings rather than a financial benefit, and water savings from an environmental perspective rather than a cost savings benefit. More than 2/3 of the residents at Little Stringy Bark Creek who said their tanks were non-operational said that they intended to fix them. But having said that, there was a lag in the time. There was a delay in the time taken to seek a repair to that system, and that was found to be because residents gave higher priority to the repair of other common household assets like cars and heaters and washing and cooking appliances, and on average a sort of a 15-day delay in seeking a repair to the tank system. I think the most extreme example was a year of a tank not being operational. A way to head this off would be to design a network with built-in redundancies so that outcomes are still being delivered even if the overall system is not operating at 100% efficiency. And this could be done by installing more assets than we think we need or larger assets. Still on the subject of maintenance, residents, if residents are expected to look after their tank systems, then they really need to know what they need to do as well as how often they need to do it and what that's going to cost them. So ways to do this would be to provide information on the common issues that might arise, things like blocked inlets or pump malfunction. How to know whether your system is failing. So as an example, is your tank always full? And information on the types of activities that residents can do themselves and when and where they need to seek professional advice. And look, there was some evidence that providing maintenance information did translate to more action. At Dobsons Creek, there was more information that was provided to participants in round 2 of the program, and they were able to nominate more specific maintenance frequencies and activities as a result. I feel like this is a bit of a no-brainer that higher capital costs in the form of quality components is likely to support more effective function. Fewer faults and breakdowns means that tanks are more likely to be operating at any point in time. If a third-party maintenance program is offered, that means fewer call-outs, so cost savings, and greater satisfaction for residents as well, because I think there were some complaints in some of the projects that about perceived poor quality of, say, the pumps, and so things like pumps being noisy or pumps intermittently switching on and off when water was not in use, being annoying to either the residents or the neighbours, particularly if those pumps were located close to bedrooms and then they were turning on and off at night. And look, this is findings, sort of anecdotal reports from outside of this case study review, but we do hear anecdotal reports of residents disconnecting their pumps and even sometimes uninstalling their rainwater tanks. Finally, thinking about long-term engagement, because systems really, they need to operate in perpetuity for waterway health, so that, that really making it clear that the benefit of the asset continues beyond the initial engagement and installation process. And ways that this could be done could be doing things like providing a central repository of operation and maintenance information. And if participation is motivated by waterway health, then residents want to know if their system's working. And so this could be done through things like newsletters, websites, smartphone apps. And this image here is the smartphone app that South East Water uses for their tank talk systems. And so things like technologies like this could be really useful for providing near live updates and even reminders to encourage residents to maintain their engagement. Having said that, though, given the effectiveness of face-to-face contact, regular inspections might still be a really useful option, because it means that the project team can check that assets are functioning, that residents are confident to maintain them and to offer support if they're not. And finally, a really important thing for long-term engagement is to think about what happens when property ownership changes hands and how to engage the new owners or residents of those properties. So to sum up, community participation can support urban waterway management, but it does increase complexity. Voluntary participants tended to be motivated more by environmental outcomes rather than financial benefits. Having said that, though, cost, time and trust are key barriers. So we really need to think about how do we make it as easy as possible for the community to get involved. Community advocacy can be really powerful for community participation, but residents need support to help them look after their rainwater tanks. And effective long-term operation relies on long-term engagement. So to finish up, look, I think Darren and Steph and I all felt like this project in a way raised as many questions as we were able to answer. And look, there's still much to be learned from Aqua Revo. South East Water have recently conducted a survey of resident attitudes, and they're also collecting information on the cost of operating that third-party maintenance service. So we're still waiting to, there's still much to be learned from Aqua Revo. I also wanted to finish off by looking ahead and talking a little bit about the Monbulk Creek Smart Water Network project, which is really trying to answer some of those questions that we weren't able to answer in this particular project. So thinking about, does that real-time control translate to better performance? Can we increase community participation through having a sense of connection to place, or having an iconic species like the platypus in the local waterway? And how can technology support greater resident engagement? And look, that's probably all I want to say about the project at the moment, because it is just getting started, other than watch this space. So thank you for listening today, and thank you to the many people who helped provide information for this case study review.